Okay, let's talk about plotting and pantsing. Broadly speaking, these are the two main ways that stories are created, right? Now, people like to talk about themselves as either plotters or pantsers, but the truth is that those two categories are just different poles on a continuum. And you might have somebody who's like, a real like plotter, and you might have somebody who's like a real pantser, but most people are going to be somewhere in that in between range. Myself, I usually am more of a plotter, which means that I like to create the plot. I like to know where the plot is, and I figure out what the moments in the plot are, and then I figure out how do I get my characters to be the kinds of people who are going to have those moments, and then how do I make those moments happen? What are the transitions? How do I need to lead up to a moment in order to pay it off, right? So if you think about authors who are really strong plotters, you might think of people like Neil Gaiman in the fantasy writing realm. So Neil Gaiman is always looking for these set pieces. He's looking for these particular locations that he wants people to go to, that he wants his characters to be in, because those locations are inherently interesting, and he wants something to happen. So he'll have like these reveals where it's turned out that one person has actually been, this other person all along. Somebody has a great secret. They reveal that secret. It's really interesting. So you can think of this as basically everything that happens in your mystery kind of stories, because all of those mystery stories, they're giving you certain pieces of information so that you can theoretically figure it out. But then they sprinkle in some of that, like some of those red herrings, some of that information that turns out not to be super useful, things that lead you astray. But then they always give you a couple of pieces that if you'd just been paying attention, if you'd just seen it, you think, oh, that's what it was all along. Because that's what makes a mystery satisfying, right? You have to feel like, oh, I could have figured this out. And the writer makes sure to guide you through that feeling. That's plotting, okay? Pantsing is a little bit different. Pantsing comes from flying by the seat of your pants, which means that you're doing things and you're kind of making up everything as it goes along. The usual method of pantsing is to set up a whole bunch of characters. Usually, you need a lot of characters because you need enough potential interactions that you can like switch the characters around. You can kind of make them do some things, and sometimes you need to move them into different places. So you might have like a large world with an ensemble cast, lots and lots of stuff in the sandbox to play with, so to speak. And then, as a pantser, you set up an elaborate backstory and then some kind of conflict, and then you just see how that goes as time progresses. So the characters being inherently interesting people, they are going to interact with each other. You set them up with some conflicts. Somebody wants something, somebody else wants something that's maybe opposed to that. They start conflicting with each other, and then the story kind of it doesn't write itself, right? That's kind of like the misnomer. But when you hear writers say, "Oh, this character, they just won't do what I want them to do," that's a pantsing thing, right? Because what's happening is you're saying, "Oh, well, I've set this character up to be this kind of person, and now that means that they have to be in a situation that's kind of like this." And you just go with it because you think, oh, that's a really interesting place for them to be. And you're constantly asking yourself, well, what would my character do right now? Whereas somebody who's really, really strong in plotting would already know, okay, I need this thing to happen, but I need to affect my character in such a way that when they make this choice that I need them to make, because they're going to make that choice, how can it feel authentic? And maybe you then go back in time and you give them an event. So if I have a character and they need to do something, they need to like betray somebody. Well, there has to be a motivation for them. There has to be a reason why they're gonna make that betrayal. And usually a betrayal is done because that character values something else more. Maybe they value someone else more. So that means I have to go back in time and I have to say, okay, then there has to be some other character here. They have to be really important. They have to be in danger. And then being in danger, I can make this character betray these other characters. So plotting really asks the writer to figure out everything that's going to happen in the story so that you can set everything up and pay everything off at the appropriate time. So plotting and pantsing work very, very differently. A lot of times your plotters are figuring out where does this character need to be at the very end of their arc, and then they're working backwards and they're figuring out how do I put them in the situation so that everything feels right, everything feels fulfilling. Whereas a pantser is almost always working from the beginning and then they're working towards the end. They just say, okay, I set this up in this initial condition, so I have these nations, they're at war. Here are the politicians, here are the generals, here are the people who just get swept up in it all, and then I have them all interact, and then they end up at their end state. Now, sometimes you have situations where you're going to do both, and I think everybody does both. Sometimes you just think of something later on and you think, oh, that would be really interesting. Hey, where can I go with this? And so your plotters might do a little bit of pantsing, and then your pantsers usually have something, right? You can't just say, oh, I'll just keep on going until I run out of book. Right. Cynically speaking, you might think, oh, I think some people do that, and maybe there's a little bit of truth to that. Sometimes I wonder about a book series that goes on for 14 books or something like that, and there seems to be no end in sight. One of the vulnerabilities of a pantser is that by doing all of that pantsing, you don't know where it's going to end. So it's really easy to just keep on thinking of stuff and saying, okay, this is something interesting. This is something interesting. Oh, I could create this secret society. Oh, that's cool. And it's really easy to just start adding in more and more characters, doing more and more things, and then not really knowing how to control that or how it's going to end. If we look at television, I think the television show Lost was a really good example of this, where the writers clearly had a lot of ideas. There was a lot of stuff that they were doing, and in the end, Lost had a very unfulfilling ending because everybody was looking at all of those plot elements and they were expecting everything to end up in one perfect moment where everything made sense and all the loose ends were just woven in nicely and all the characters were paid off, and what we got was it's just not that, right? I mean, the ending is what it is. I don't want to give it away for anybody who hasn't seen it. But that's a very, maybe not a typical, but maybe it's a stereotypical ending of a pantsing work because you have so much complexity, you can't pay that off. It's impossible. And so you don't even try. And so you just do with the story what you can do. So going to an extremely long length is a danger of pantsing. The danger of plotting is that you have to have everything right. So there's going to be a real problem if you get to the end of your book and then you realize, oh man, like there was this one detail and I forgot about it. I need to go back in time. Only the problem is I'm writing this like book trilogy. The first book has already been created. I can't go back in time. I can't change that motivation. Now you have to adjust that final moment that you were working towards, and maybe it's not that moment that you want anymore. So plotters can sometimes get too caught up in controlling every part of the work, and what they end up doing is just like kind of thinking and writing for years and years and years and years and years because they have to have everything exactly right, because the novel is just this set of moving parts and they have to fit together with perfect precision for all of the characters to interact the way that the plot needs them to, and to create the moment that the audience is going to experience. So plotting can definitely have problems in that you might have your writer who, takes like 4 years to write the next book, and you wonder whether or not the next book is going to come out at all because they're working so hard on it that they just cannot finish that. They have to have every single piece correct. I think plotting and pantsing can both produce really good fiction. I think that they can both produce really, really good stories. They're just stories that feel a little bit different and they work in different ways. Those pantsing stories are often really spontaneous, then they can be really fun, and they can be just completely chock full of stuff and have a very, very dramatic emotional feeling to them, because typically your pantser writers are just very, very energetic as well. Whereas I think that your plotting authors can create these like singular moments that feel like everything is just working and everything was just worth it. So that feeling of satisfaction, that feeling of, man, like I wasn't completely sure where this was going, but this definitely makes it feel like the whole novel trilogy or like the whole movie or whatever it is, it just feels like it was worth it. It feels satisfying. Is that's the strength of the plotting. Depending on which one you might want to read plotters or you might want to read pantsers. I really think that's everybody's choice. I'm a little bit more of a plotter than a pantser because I really like that moment of satisfaction and it's how I like thinking about stories. But you might be different, and when you write your own fiction and you read fiction, maybe you want to do things differently, and I think that's great.